We're going to be talking today about CI/CD pipelines for DBT. So making sure we have reliable deployments and everything goes smoothly. But when we start thinking about CI/CD pipelines, there are options for building everything yourself or using some things that might come out of the box from SaaS tools such as DBT Cloud. So we're going to explore the different options that are there today and figure out which might be right for you. But before we do that, just a little bit of background on who I am. My name's Cameron Sear. I live in the Nashville area of Tennessee. Originally from Texas, grew up here and moved over to Nashville. But I am pretty much interested in all things data, right? If it's data related, it is something that I get interested in. But I do specialize in data engineering. I'm a staff data engineer at a company called Breezeway. We build a property management software for short-term rental companies, property managers. So I'm also in the Nashville area. I help lead the data communities there. So I'm involved heavily in the Nashville Data Engineering Meetup group. I work with some of the other ones as well. I've been using DBT for almost 5 years now. So have had a lot of experience using DBT, deploying DBT for different companies, and have gone through the hard part of the deployment process of DBT and have made the mistakes so that you don't have to. And hopefully we'll talk about that today and how we can make those deployments reliable and not have to worry so much about are things going to work once they're into production. And then lastly, I wrote about some of this stuff in a book called Unlocking DBT. So myself and co-author named Dustin Dorsey, we noticed that there was a gap in the market for learning DBT. There's great online courses. There were great documentation written by DBT, but there was no book. And some people just like to get their hands on a physical copy of a book. I'm one of those people. So we're like, hey, there's this great opportunity to write this book. So Unlocking DBT is about the different components of DBT from beginning to end, right? We don't stick to like a data engineering approach or analytics engineering approach. We don't go heavily into different data modeling practices. It's strictly about the product and different ways you can implement it, deploy it. CI/CD is one of those things that we do talk about it towards the end of the book. So that's out there if you're interested. But enough about me. Let's dive into what we're all here for today. So which is CI/CD pipelines for DBT. This presentation, of course, makes some assumptions that you already know what DBT is, but we will spend a quick few minutes here reviewing what is DBT. So DBT is an acronym, stands for Data Build Tool. That just means that it represents the T in the ELT or ETL process, right? Or in other words, it's a data transformation tool, right? You can use it to build out SQL transformations, Python transformations. That's a newer feature of DBT. It's great for both of those things. It allows you to modularize those things that in the past weren't, right? And so if you come from past life of SQL transformations, you may have lived in the world of stored procedures for a very long time. So DBT is a nice addition to the stack to be able to get away from some of that hard to understand data lineage. And lastly, it's an abstraction layer for a lot of that boilerplate code that lives in your data transformation pipelines. So all of the DML, DDL, that kind of stuff is abstracted away for you, right? You only have to worry about returning a data frame if you're building out Python transformations or just writing a select statement if you're building out SQL transformations. All right, so that's the quick review of what is DBT, what is CI/CD before we get into what that means for DBT. But CI/CD is a modern DevOps practice that's for reliable code changes, right? It's just a way that we can make sure that code is good before we release it to production and get it released into production in an automated way so that we can speed up deployments. So that breaks it down into two parts, right? That first part is CI, which stands for continuous integration. We want to make sure in that step that we can build our project, whatever it may be. In this context, we're talking about a DBT project, and we want to test it to make sure that everything works as we expect it, right? That might be in the context of DBT, might be unit testing and or data quality testing. Typically in software, we might more be thinking about like regression testing or unit testing in there. And this is all going to be done in an automated way, right? So we're removing the human factor from running the test suite. And then the second part of the CI/CD pipeline would be continuous deployment. So this is where we're going to do automated deployment of code changes, if you so choose. But You don't have to worry about doing a release cycle or anything like that. The thought of continuous deployment is that I have a pull request or merge request, and then when I actually merge that into my production branch, whatever it may be, a pipeline kicks off and it just deploys the code for me in an automated way. And like I said, having these two things, having them in an automated fashion, minimizes the human error. We don't have to worry so much about, all right, is this pipeline going to work expected as we expected? Are we going to push things out to production and they're going to work correctly? Well, we've taken some of that human error out of there because we don't have to deploy things manually. We don't have to test things manually. It's all done in an automated fashion. All right. So why do we care about this for DBT projects specifically, though, right? Well, there's different high-level constructs that we can think about. The first one would be we standardize engineering expectations via automated checks. And so that's the CI part, right? We can say, okay, we need to automate the checking of linting, make sure all of our files are linted, right? That we're conforming to our standard practice for how we want our files to be structured. Or we might want to run the test suite. Maybe that's unit testing, data quality testing. We want to make sure the project builds all of that stuff, all of the engineering expectations before code ever gets released into production. It also optimizes the code review process too, though. So it's not just to make sure that things get done in a trustworthy way. Of course, that's important, but quite often there's a code review process within companies where I'm opening a pull request or merge request, and then I have to have, say, one or two of my colleagues review my code. Well, if you don't have any sort of CI/CD pipeline built out, there's not any automated checks that you can just see, right? You don't automatically see whether linting is passed. You don't automatically see whether testing is passed. And so by having those CI checks in there, it helps optimize that code review process, because then when your colleagues come in to review your code, they can just see, cool, linting's already checked, unit test is already checked. They don't have to worry about that. They can actually dig into the things that matter, like maybe making sure that your logic is sound within the code itself. We also, have the potential for reducing downtime. Again, this is the part where we talked about removing that human error. So we can reduce downtime because there's less human error when we're deploying code in an automated fashion. We're testing code in an automated fashion. And then last but not least, we can stop wasting time deploying code. When you deploy code to production, it's a very repeatable process. You're typically going to go through the same steps every single time. And so, hey, if we can just automate that using some YAML configuration or however we do it, we can stop wasting time deploying code, and I don't have to spend an hour deploying code. I can just merge my pull request in and then get back onto the next thing. No need to worry about that kind of stuff. All right. So that's why we should care about it. But what are the actual steps for CI/CD within the context of a DBT project? Well, over here on the right, we can just look at what the actual kind of life cycle is of CI/CD. It's not just a one direction flow, right? CI/CD is continuous, right? I mean, continuous integration, continuous deployment. It's never stopping, right? So we can kind of start with the development process, move on to source control, so checking our changes in, and we'll move on to building and testing before it actually gets merged into production. We're going to report on those builds and those tests and any other checks we might have so that we can see whether they've passed or not. And then last but not least, if everything works as we expect it, we're going to deploy it. And then the process starts over, right? Develop more, deploy more, develop more, deploy more. All right, so but what are the actual steps within a DBT project? So the first one would be, we want to build the changes to the code that we've made in an isolated environment. The isolated environment piece is important. We don't want to build our changes that we've made to our DBT project in our production database. That would defeat the purpose of the CI/CD check here, right? We want to make sure in an isolated environment that looks similar, if not an exact copy of production, but we want to make sure that it works in that environment, because if it doesn't, cool, we know there's an issue. We need to go back and fix it before we release these changes. And then we never even messed up production. So production is continuing to run smooth just as it is, no problem. Other things we might do would include unit testing. There's different ways that you can run unit testing. So there's packages out there such as DBT unit test or DBT data mock tool. There's also data diff if you want to check whether or not your data looks the same in production as it does in your change branch. Next up, we have linting and formatting. This is another step that you might want to automate, right? There's a lot of argument, specifically in SQL, but sometimes in Python too. There can be a lot of argument about stylistic, formatting interest, and some people might like, for example, in SQL, might like all caps, or some people might like lowercase. Well, we can standardize that. We can put it into SQL Fluff. We can format it. We can lint it. No need to argue about that stuff in the pull request anymore. Done. We just have an automated check. If it doesn't pass, if it doesn't pass our standards, it'll fail. The developer needs to go back and reformat it and then push it back in. So that's SQL Fluff in, with regards to SQL, of course. But in a DBT project, it's not all SQL. There's a lot of YAML. If you've ever worked in a DBT project, there's a lot of YAML. So you can use something like Prettier to format that. Then there's also Black, which can be utilized for Python. All right, we might also want to validate project best practices. Again, if you've worked in a DBT project, you know that there are some standards on how you might want to format your project, right? Maybe your company has a standard that you should have staging models, intermediate models, and then fact and dimension models. And so if somebody's creating something that doesn't adhere to that standard, we might want to fail a CI check before it ever gets into production. Or we might want to make sure that there's at least a uniqueness test on the primary key of whatever our fact table is. Or maybe we want to make sure that there's always documentation written for a new table or a new column. And those are things that we can check, again, in CI, utilizing more packages that are out there, open source, for us to utilize. A couple of those would be DBT Checkpoint, which is managed by a third party, or there's the DBT Project Evaluator, which is managed by DBT. You can install it as a DBT package from the DBT Hub. And then last but not least is the actual deployment part, right? So the first, everything that we've talked about up until this point is kind of the CI part. Well, then the continuous delivery part is extremely important, right? We don't want to have the human error aspect in there. And so this is where we can get the automated deployment of validated code. Depending on whether you're using open source version of DBT, or if you're using DBT Cloud, will change how you actually deploy this. So you might use something like GitHub Actions to actually deploy your code, or if you're using DBT Cloud, of course, like you just merge your changes into your Git branch, and then DBT Cloud will handle the deployment of that code for you. All right. So what are the actual steps that would require DIY, right? And so we've talked about so far, well, if we think about what the idea of this presentation is should I build it myself, or should I should I just use a SaaS product, right? In the context of a DBT project, there are things that are going to require DIY, at least as of today. Doesn't matter whether you're going to use a SaaS product or not. One of those would be linting and formatting. And again, we can use this to get the argument about formatting out of our pull request process, out of the code review process. So that's things like SQL Fluff, Prettier, Black. These are going to require you to build them yourself. Next one that would require DIY would be deploying DBT Core to a Docker environment, or deploying DBT Core to an orchestration tool. These aren't mutually exclusive. They can be done in unison, or, together as well. But yeah, if you're going to deploy DBT Core to, say, a Docker environment, or to orchestration tool like Airflow or Dagster, either one of those, you could do manually, but that would be pretty error prone. And so you want to build out processes so that you don't have to do that manually, right? You can build out processes to do that in an automated fashion. All right. Continuing on, in what would require DIY is customized documentation. So DBT has a documentation feature where it will build a documentation site for you. But you can get very crafty with the documentation side if you're using DBT Core in the open source solution and you're deploying your own documentation. You can actually customize the documentation pretty extensively, like pretty much anything in the CSS you can override the DBT defaults. So by default, if you've ever built documentation using DBT, it puts the DBT logo up in the top left corner. It uses DBT colors throughout the documentation, which is fine, but like to my end users that are utilizing the models that I've built in dbt, they might not even know what dbt is. And so they go to this documentation site and be like, what is this thing? So instead, at Breezeway, we've actually overwritten all of those defaults. As you can see, I have a little example over here. You can see our Breezeway logo up in the top left corner. You can't see it so much, but we've also overridden the colors so that it matches the color palette of Breezeway. We've added some customized descriptions here. We've got a star schema here in the middle that shows like kind of how our data warehouse model is built out. This can be done by generating the documentation. So you generate that base documentation as you would with dbt. And then you rewrite that documentation because it just spits out like an index.html file. So you rewrite that documentation to a new index.html that you have more or less copied from the original one, but you've added some custom CSS. So within our GitHub repo, we have index.html.example, which is what we use as like that's where we house that CSS. And then we have a script that overrides everything every time we deploy our documentation. But as I was saying, this is very DIY, but you can see it has some great customization benefits as well. So yeah, gives you the ability to template it with your company's branding, which is great. All right, other things that are going to require DIY, unit testing. There's no out-of-the-box unit testing from dbt Cloud, for example. Same with those pre-commit checks or running project evaluator. We'll have to do all of that ourselves. So I've talked a lot about like doing it yourself, but what does that actually mean? How do you DIY CI/CD steps? Typically, it's going to be done in YAML files. So, and you'll do it in whatever your favorite CI/CD tool might be, right? So that could be GitHub Actions, GitLab CI/CD, Azure DevOps, Jenkins, if that's something you have to use. But yeah, it'll typically be done in YAML files, and I have just a quick snippet over here on the right-hand side that might show what one of those workflows looks like. So in GitHub, we call them workflows. This is a GitHub example, but this is what it shows like what we have. We have a reusable linting workflow that we run. And as you can see over here on the right, the first image on the right, workflow call, inputs, ref, all of this. This is basically just saying that, all right, cool, we're going to fire this off whenever a pull request is added or updated. There's some environment variables, and then there's just the actual job that tells the runner what to do. And the runner in this sense is GitHub Actions. It's more or less just a virtual machine, and we have some YAML configuration that says what steps to run, right? So we set up Python, we install our Python packages that we need for our environment. So of course, that's going to be things like dbt. We're using SQL Fluff here to lint, so the SQL Fluff would be included in there. Any other things that you might have or need in your Python environment for your particular project. Yeah, and then so we're going to, over here also, this would add dbt dependencies. Or I'm sorry, yeah, run the dbt dependencies, make sure everything is like set up for our dbt environment. And then last but not least, we're going to just lint all of the files. Since this is CI, we don't necessarily want to lint the entire project every time somebody opens a pull request. It typically makes sense in any CI step. We're talking about linting here, but in any CI step, you want to try to limit the scope of what you're doing. And typically that means just working on the diffs that you've created, right? So new code or changed code. And so here we're running, in this example, we're going to run SQL Fluff and lint our files, but we're only going to do it on the things that were actually changed, right? So if there's old unlinted files, like we're not going to block somebody's pull request because of that. Yeah, and then you can set thresholds on when, specifically to SQL Fluff, you can set thresholds on when this might fail. But those kinds of things you will want to be able to configure for any CI step. So this is what it means to DIY CI/CD, right? Again, typically building things out in YAML, building out workflows, but they're very customizable. All right, so we've talked a lot about the things that you have to do, regardless of whether you're using dbt Cloud, dbt Core. Those are all the things that if you want those CI steps in your project, you're going to have to build them yourself, at least current state. Now, what does dbt Cloud do for you out of the box? Well, there's features in dbt Cloud such as running a CI job triggered by pull request or merge request. And what I mean by CI job there is I'm talking specifically about running a dbt build command or dbt run and then subsequent test command on just the diffs in your project, right? There's different ways that you can do that in dbt. Sorry, I'm going to go back one more. dbt Cloud will run that in an isolated environment for you. Got a little asterisk here because that's not recommended. Even by dbt, they stated out in their documentation, like it's not recommended to use that default nature. You want to try to build this in a totally isolated environment if possible. And that's something that we talked about again earlier at the beginning of the presentation. dbt Cloud will automatically deploy that hosted documentation site for you and deploy that production code for you. But again, this is all going to go straight to dbt Cloud, right? So if you need to customize your documentation site, it's going to be, impossible to do with dbt Cloud. If you want to deploy your production code to, like, say, Dagster or Airflow to orchestrate it as part of a larger workflow, not impossible with dbt Cloud, but it will still require somewhat of a DIY piece. So here's just a quick overview to show you what dbt Cloud does versus what you can do with DIY. It's all the things we've talked about, but the consensus here is that when you DIY CI/CD, you can pretty much do anything you want, right? Like there's very little limitation to what you can or cannot do. All right, so let's answer the question: DIY or DIY? Well, it depends. But really, which should you do? So here's my opinion on the matter. If you're using dbt Cloud, utilize its features wherever you can. So build your diffs in there. If you don't care about customized documentation, just have it deploy the documentation site for you. It'll host it for you. You don't have to worry about hosting it on S3 or GitHub Pages or anything like that. Use DIY, though, to fill in the gaps, right? So things like linting, unit testing, those are extremely important, but dbt Cloud isn't going to do them for you. And I do think that whether you're using dbt Cloud or dbt Core, you should have those steps as part of your CI/CD process. And so you're going to need to build those out yourself. And then lastly, if you're using dbt Core, this doesn't really matter because you got to build everything yourself. But even if you're using dbt Core, you'll want to build all of this yourself because you still care about having quality production code and making sure that your builds are going to build correctly before you go to production and everything gets finalized there.